In 1903, in a small farming community outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a woman gave birth to twins who emerged from the womb already speaking in a language that no linguist has ever been able to identify, forming complete sentences within seconds of their first breath. And when doctors tried to separate them to examine each individually, both children began screaming in perfect synchronization, and their heart rates dropped so dangerously low that reuniting them was the only way to... Before we dive into these mysteries, drop in the comments. What time is it where you are? And can you sleep after hearing these stories? And if you're brave enough not to miss any of our weekly cases, subscribe to the channel now. Turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and let's unravel this enigma. The twins, whom we'll call Grace and Helen to protect what little privacy their descendants might have, were born on March 14th, 1903, to a woman named Margaret Sullivan, the wife of a coal miner in the small town of Braddock, just outside Pittsburgh. The birth itself was unremarkable until the moment of delivery. The attending physician, Dr. "Keep them alive!" Thomas Whitmore documented in his personal journals, which were discovered in the archives of the Allegheny County Medical Society in 1994, that the first twin, Grace, emerged, and immediately, before her lungs should have even fully inflated, began speaking. Not crying, not the usual newborn sounds, but actual articulated words in what he described as a flowing, melodic language he had never encountered. Within 15 seconds, the second twin, Helen, was delivered, and she too began speaking in the same language, and more impossibly, the two appeared to be having a conversation. Dr. Whitmore wrote that he stood frozen, convinced he was experiencing some kind of hallucination brought on by the exhaustion of a 36-hour shift. The midwife present, an experienced woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who had delivered over 300 babies in her career, later testified to a medical inquiry board that she heard the same thing: two newborn infants, umbilical cords still attached, speaking to each other in complete sentences in a language that sounded like nothing she had ever heard, with phonemes and rhythms that seemed almost musical. The mother, Margaret, was semi-conscious from the difficult labor and didn't initially comprehend what was happening. When the medical staff attempted to perform the standard newborn examinations, separating the twins to different examination tables approximately 6 feet apart, both infants immediately stopped speaking and began screaming. But it wasn't normal infant crying. Dr. Whitmore described it as a sound of pure terror and anguish, far more intense than any newborn cry he had encountered. More alarmingly, both babies' heart rates, which had been normal moments before, dropped precipitously. Grace's heart rate fell from 140 beats per minute to 62 in less than 30 seconds. Helen's dropped even faster, reaching 58 beats per minute. Their skin began turning blue, indicating oxygen deprivation. The medical staff, panicking, brought the infants back together, placing them side by side. Within seconds of physical contact, both heart rates normalized, their color returned, and they stopped screaming. They resumed speaking to each other in that unknown language, now in what sounded like soothing tones. The implications were medically impossible. Newborns don't speak. Their vocal cords and neural development aren't capable of producing language. Newborns don't have conversations, they don't have the cognitive capacity or linguistic knowledge, and newborns certainly don't exhibit physiological distress, requiring proximity to a sibling beyond normal comfort-seeking. Yet all of this was documented by multiple witnesses and recorded in medical records that still exist today. Over the following weeks, Grace and Helen were studied by physicians from the University of Pittsburgh, and even specialists brought in from Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. The findings were consistent and baffling. The twins appeared neurologically normal in every measurable way. Brain size, reflexes, motor development, all within expected parameters. But they continued speaking in their private language, which linguists who examined them could not classify. It wasn't baby talk or gibberish. It had consistent grammatical structure, repeated vocabulary, and clear communicative intent. Dr. Edmund Meyer, a linguist from the University of Pennsylvania who studied the twins for 2 months in 1903, published a paper in the Journal of the American Philological Association describing the language as having approximately 200 distinct phonemes, far more than any known human language, which typically range from 11 to 144. The syntax appeared to be based on tonal variations and rhythmic patterns as much as word order. And most impossibly, both twins used it identically, with no apparent learning period. They emerged from the womb already fluent. The physiological dependence was equally inexplicable. Any separation beyond approximately 15 feet caused both twins to experience rapid onset tachycardia, difficulty breathing, and what appeared to be extreme psychological distress. Medical professionals theorized everything from shared circulatory anomalies that had persisted after birth to some kind of psychological bonding so intense it manifested physical symptoms. But examinations revealed no physical connections, no shared organs, no anomalies in their cardiovascular or nervous systems. They were, by all anatomical measures, 2 separate individuals. Yet functionally, they operated as a single unit. As the twins grew, their oddities became more pronounced rather than diminishing. By age 2, when most children are just beginning to form simple sentences in their native language, Grace and Helen were speaking fluent English, having apparently learned it by observation, but they only used English when communicating with others. Between themselves, they exclusively used their private language, which had apparently grown more complex. Linguists who continued to study them documented that their private language now seemed to have developed written symbols. The twins would draw intricate characters that repeated across their drawings, suggesting a written form of their spoken language. No one taught them to write. Standard schooling in written English wouldn't begin for several more years, yet they had somehow created or accessed a complete written language system. The Sullivan family, overwhelmed and frightened by the attention their daughters were receiving, became increasingly isolated. Margaret Sullivan, according to letters preserved in family archives, wrote to her sister in 1906, describing how the twins would sometimes speak for hours in their language while staring at each other, barely blinking, in what looked like a trance state. During these episodes, which the family called the conversations, both girls would become completely unresponsive to external stimuli. You could shout their names, touch them, even shake them gently, and they wouldn't react. Then, simultaneously, they would blink, turn away from each other, and resume normal behavior as if nothing had happened. In 1908, when the twins were 5 years old, researchers from the newly established Eugenics Record Office in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, heard about the case and requested to study the twins. The Sullivan family refused, but the researchers were persistent, and eventually, through legal pressure citing concerns about the children's well-being and education, they gained limited access. Dr. Charles Davenport, the director of the ERO, personally examined Grace and Helen in May of 1908. His report, which remained classified in the ERO archives until the facility was discredited and shut down in the 1940s, described the twins as representing either an evolutionary anomaly or evidence of capabilities latent in all humans that these particular children had somehow accessed. He was particularly fascinated by what he called their sensory sharing. In controlled experiments, researchers would show an image to Grace while Helen was in another room with her eyes covered. When asked to draw what she saw, Helen would produce a drawing remarkably similar to the image shown only to Grace. The accuracy rate over 50 trials was 68%, far above what chance would allow. The reverse worked equally well when stimuli were presented to Helen first. This suggested some form of information transfer between the twins that couldn't be explained by any known biological mechanism. But the most disturbing discovery came in September of 1908. During a routine physical examination, Grace suffered a minor injury, a needle stick during a blood draw that went slightly deeper than intended, causing a small but painful puncture wound. Helen, who was across the room and couldn't see her sister, immediately cried out and grabbed her own arm in the exact location where Grace had been stuck. When researchers examined Helen's arm, they found a small red mark, almost like a stigmata, appearing in the precise spot corresponding to her sister's injury. There was no puncture, no broken skin, but the mark was visible, and Helen insisted it hurt. Within 20 minutes, the mark faded and disappeared. The researchers repeated variations of this experiment over the following weeks, always with parental permission, though that permission was obtained under significant pressure. The results were consistent. Pain inflicted on one twin produced a sympathetic response in the other, including visible marks that would appear and fade. The intensity of the response seemed to correlate with the intensity of the original stimulus and the proximity of the twins to each other. At distances under 10 feet, the response was almost identical to the original injury. At distances over 50 feet, the response diminished but was still present. Are you feeling that chill down your spine? If you're enjoying this mystery, leave a like on the video to help us keep investigating cases like this. And in the comments, tell us, have you heard about this case before, or do you know any different theories? Subscribe so you don't miss the next enigmas. Now get ready, because what comes next will keep you from sleeping. In 1912, when Grace and Helen were 9 years old, their father, Patrick Sullivan, died in a mining accident. The family's financial situation became desperate, and Margaret was forced to make an impossible decision. She could no longer care for both twins while working to support the family. After agonizing deliberation and against all medical advice, she agreed to send one twin, Helen, to live with her sister's family in Cleveland, Ohio, approximately 130 miles away. The medical professionals who had studied the twins warned that separation could be catastrophic, but Margaret had no choice. On October 3rd, 1912, Helen was placed on a train to Cleveland. Grace remained in Braddock with her mother. What happened over the next 72 hours was documented by multiple sources and remains one of the most disturbing cases in early 20th century medical literature. Within 6 hours of separation, both twins began exhibiting severe symptoms. Grace, according to her mother's diary, became catatonic, staring at nothing, unresponsive to any stimuli. Her heart rate was erratic, alternating between dangerously high and dangerously low. She wouldn't eat, wouldn't drink, wouldn't speak. In Cleveland, Helen's aunt sent an urgent telegram reporting identical symptoms. Both girls had developed fevers of 103 degrees Fahrenheit, despite showing no signs of infection. Both were experiencing what appeared to be seizures, though neurological examinations, as much as was possible in 1912, showed no typical seizure activity. By the second day, both twins had lost consciousness. Doctors in both cities, communicating by telegraph, were baffled. Every test they could perform showed no pathological cause for the symptoms. It was as if both girls were simply shutting down, dying from the separation itself. On the third day, October 6th, Margaret Sullivan made the decision that saved her daughters' lives. She borrowed money for train fare, traveled to Cleveland, and brought Helen back to Braddock. When Helen's train arrived and she was brought within sight of Grace, both girls simultaneously opened their eyes, their fevers broke within minutes, and their vital signs normalized. By that evening, they were speaking to each other in their private language, eating normally, and showing no residual effects of the crisis. Medical reports from both Dr. Whitmore in Pittsburgh and Dr. Gerald Foster in Cleveland were submitted to the Journal of the American Medical Association. The editor, Dr. George Simmons, rejected the papers, writing in his response letter that the described phenomena were so far outside accepted medical understanding that publication would damage the journal's credibility. The reports remained in private archives until they were discovered by medical historians in the 1980s. The twins were never separated again. Margaret Sullivan found work that allowed her to keep both daughters with her, and the family lived in relative obscurity for the next several years. The twins attended school, though they were placed in special classes due to their unusual bond and the disruption their private language caused. Teachers reported that Grace and Helen were highly intelligent, excelling in mathematics and science, but they remained socially isolated from other children, seeming to need no companionship beyond each other. In 1918, when the influenza pandemic swept through the United States, both twins contracted the virus. Given their unusual physiological connection, doctors feared that if one died, the other would immediately follow. Both girls became severely ill, and for 2 weeks their survival was uncertain. But remarkably, both recovered, their symptoms progressing in perfect synchronization. When Grace's fever broke, so did Helen's, within minutes. When Helen began eating again, Grace did the same. It was as if their immune systems were coordinated, fighting the illness as a single unit. By 1920, when Grace and Helen were 17, the medical community had largely forgotten about them, and the family preferred it that way. The twins had learned to minimize their oddities in public, speaking only English when others were present, maintaining physical distance that didn't trigger their distress response, appearing to outside observers as merely unusually close sisters. But in private, according to journals kept by Grace and discovered after her death, they continued their profound connection. She wrote that she and Helen could share thoughts without speaking, even in English or their private language. They could sense each other's emotions, physical sensations, even dreams. She described feeling like they were two halves of a single consciousness, and the few times they had been forced apart, even briefly, felt like being torn in half. In 1926, both twins married in a double ceremony. Their husbands, brothers named Robert and James Chen, immigrants from China who worked in a Pittsburgh laundry, were apparently accepting of the twins' unusual bond. The marriages produced children. Grace had 3 daughters, Helen had 2 sons, and the cousins grew up in neighboring houses in Pittsburgh's Hill District, with the twin sisters maintaining daily contact. Medical records from the twins' adult years are sparse, as they avoided doctors whenever possible, but family members interviewed by researchers decades later confirmed that the core oddities persisted. The twins continued speaking their private language, continued experiencing sympathetic physical responses to each other's injuries and illnesses, and remained psychologically dependent on regular proximity. In 1963, Grace, then 60 years old, suffered a severe stroke. She was rushed to Montefiore Hospital in Pittsburgh, where she remained in critical condition for 3 days. Helen, who had been visiting her daughter in Philadelphia when Grace collapsed, immediately knew something was wrong. According to her son, Michael Chen, who was with her at the time, Helen suddenly clutched her head, screamed that Grace was dying, and collapsed. She was taken to a Philadelphia hospital, where doctors found she was exhibiting neurological symptoms consistent with a stroke, including left-side weakness and speech difficulties, despite brain scans showing no evidence of a cerebrovascular accident. When Helen was informed that Grace had suffered a stroke, she demanded to be taken to Pittsburgh. Against medical advice, she checked herself out of the Philadelphia hospital and made the trip. When she arrived at Grace's hospital room and took her sister's hand, witnesses reported that both women's symptoms improved simultaneously. Grace, who had been non-responsive, opened her eyes. Helen's neurological symptoms resolved completely. Over the following weeks, as Grace slowly recovered from her stroke, Helen experienced every stage of recovery in parallel, despite never having actually had a stroke herself. When Grace regained speech, so did Helen. When Grace began walking again with a walker, Helen's gait, which had been impaired, normalized. Neurologists at Montefiore Hospital documented the case but were unable to explain it. Dr. Richard Solomon, who treated Grace, wrote in his notes that he was observing something that violated every principle of neurology he had learned. On February 9, 1971, Grace died of heart failure at the age of 67. According to hospital records and family testimony, Helen, who had been sitting beside her sister's bed holding her hand, died within 90 seconds of Grace's final heartbeat. Medical staff attempted resuscitation on Helen, but she had no cardiac event, no stroke, no apparent medical cause of death. Her heart simply stopped. The attending physician, Dr. Patricia Morrison, listed cause of death as cardiac arrest, but in a note attached to the file, she wrote that in her medical opinion, Helen had died of the loss of her twin, as if their bond was so integral to Helen's physiology that she literally could not survive without it. The case of Grace and Helen Sullivan remained obscure until 1998, when Dr. Jennifer Klein, a geneticist at Carnegie Mellon University, discovered references to the twins while researching historical medical anomalies in Pennsylvania archives. She tracked down surviving family members and obtained DNA samples from 3 of Grace's daughters and both of Helen's sons. The genetic analysis revealed something extraordinary. Grace and Helen were not just identical twins. They were, according to the analysis, genetically more similar than any identical twins ever documented. Typically, identical twins share 99.9% of their DNA, with minor differences arising from mutations during cell division. Grace and Helen's descendants carried genetic markers suggesting the twins had shared 99.99% of their DNA, an unprecedented level of genetic identity. Dr. Klein theorized that the twins might have resulted from an embryo split so early and so perfectly that virtually no genetic divergence occurred, creating 2 individuals who were, genetically speaking, nearly the same person. But genetics alone couldn't explain the linguistic abilities, the physiological dependence, or the apparent telepathic connection. In 2003, Dr. Marcus Webb, a neuroscientist at MIT specializing in consciousness studies, published a paper in the journal Consciousness and Cognition analyzing the Sullivan twins case. He proposed that Grace and Helen might represent an instance of what he called distributed consciousness, where a single consciousness somehow manifested across 2 physical bodies. He suggested that their private language might not have been learned at all, but rather an internal language of thought that was externalized because it was shared between 2 bodies. Their physiological connection might have been the result of some quantum entanglement at a biological level, though he admitted this was purely speculative and unsupported by current physics. The paper was controversial, with many scientists dismissing it as pseudoscience, but it reignited interest in the case. But if the Sullivan twins challenge our understanding of human bonding and consciousness, the second individual we'll examine challenges our understanding of human biology itself. In August of 1947, in a rural area outside of Lexington, Kentucky, a farmer named Harold Winters called the county sheriff to report that he had found what he thought was a dead body in one of his tobacco fields. When Sheriff Thomas McKinney arrived, he found not a corpse, but a living human being, a boy who appeared to be approximately 12 years old, lying motionless in the dirt. The boy's eyes were open and tracking movement, indicating consciousness, but he made no attempt to move, speak, or respond to questions. The sheriff attempted to help the boy up, and that's when he discovered the first impossibility. The child weighed approximately 400 pounds. Harold Winters, the farmer, was a large man who stood 6'3" and weighed 240 pounds, and he couldn't lift the boy even a few inches off the ground. Sheriff McKinney called for backup, and it took 4 men to lift the child onto a stretcher and into a truck to be transported to St. Joseph Hospital in Lexington. The doctors who examined the boy, whom they named John Doe, since he carried no identification and couldn't or wouldn't speak, were confronted with a medical impossibility. The child appeared outwardly normal in size, height approximately 4'8", build appearing average for a pre-adolescent. But he weighed 417 pounds, according to the hospital's freight scale, the only scale large enough to register his weight. There was no visible obesity, no edema or swelling, no obvious explanation for the massive weight. X-rays revealed bone density approximately 3 times higher than normal human bone. His skeleton was so dense it appeared almost white on the X-ray films, similar to images of metal rather than bone. CT scans, which were still experimental in 1947 but were available at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, where John Doe was transferred, showed that his internal organs had similar increased density. His heart, liver, kidneys all appeared normal in size and position, but the tissue density was far beyond human norms. Blood tests revealed red blood cell counts nearly double the normal range, hemoglobin levels that should have indicated severe polycythemia, but somehow didn't cause any apparent blood clotting issues. His blood was, according to Dr. William Harrison, who conducted the analysis, thicker than any human blood he had examined, more like syrup than the normal fluid consistency. The boy remained non-verbal and largely unresponsive. He would open his mouth when food was offered and would chew and swallow. His bathroom needs could be managed with assistance. His eyes tracked movement, suggesting awareness, but he showed no independent movement, no attempts at communication, no emotional responses. He simply existed, a 400-pound child in an average-sized body, lying motionless in a hospital bed that had to be reinforced to support his weight. Dr. Harrison and his team spent 6 months studying John Doe, attempting to understand his condition. They discovered that his metabolism was extraordinarily slow. His resting heart rate was 32 beats per minute. His respiratory rate was 4 breaths per minute. His core body temperature was 94.2 degrees Fahrenheit, all far below normal, but apparently sustainable for him. He required very little food, approximately 600 calories per day, far less than expected for someone of his mass. It was as if his body operated on a completely different metabolic framework than normal humans. Muscle biopsies revealed tissue with fiber density unlike anything in medical literature. His muscle cells were packed far more tightly than normal, with virtually no fat infiltration, and the cells themselves appeared to have additional mitochondria, the powerhouses of cells, as if his body had adapted to support tissue that was fundamentally denser and heavier than human tissue should be. In March of 1948, John Doe, who had shown no movement beyond basic swallowing and eye tracking for 7 months, suddenly stood up. Nurses entering his room found him standing beside his bed, perfectly balanced, staring straight ahead. When they approached, he walked slowly and deliberately, each footstep creating audible impacts on the floor, to the window. He stood there for approximately 40 minutes, then walked back to his bed and lay down, resuming his previous motionless state. This pattern repeated irregularly over the following months. He would remain motionless for days or weeks, then suddenly rise, walk to specific locations, usually the window or sometimes the door, stand for extended periods, then return to bed. There was no apparent trigger, no pattern to the timing, no response to questions or requests during these mobile periods. He simply moved when some internal imperative drove him to, then stopped. In June of 1948, two men arrived at the hospital claiming to be John Doe's uncles. They provided no documentation, no proof of relationship, and their story about the boy being from an isolated community in the Appalachian Mountains and having run away was vague and unconvincing. However, they knew specific details about a birthmark on the child's lower back that had never been publicly documented. Hospital administrators, unable to identify the child through any other means and facing mounting costs for his care, released him to the men's custody. John Doe was never seen again. Attempts to trace the two men or locate the boy in the decades since have been unsuccessful. The medical records from St. Joseph Hospital and the University of Kentucky Medical Center were preserved and are available to researchers. In 1996, Dr. Sarah Chen, an endocrinologist at Johns Hopkins, reviewed the case files as part of a study on unusual metabolic disorders. She found that the documented bone density, tissue density, and metabolic parameters were so far outside normal ranges that if the records were accurate, they represented a form of human biology that shouldn't be possible. She theorized that John Doe might have suffered from an extreme, previously unknown form of osteopetrosis, a genetic disorder that causes abnormally dense bones, combined with a muscle disorder causing extreme fiber density. But osteopetrosis causes bones to be brittle despite their density, and patients suffer frequent fractures. John Doe's bones, according to the records, were not only dense, but apparently strong, showing no signs of the fractures that would be expected, and no known condition explains the metabolic anomalies, the extreme slow heart rate and respiration that somehow sustained normal consciousness, the drastically reduced caloric needs, the unusual blood composition. In 2011, the television program Medical Mysteries featured the case and attempted to locate John Doe or any information about what happened to him after 1948. They found nothing. No death certificate, no medical records from any other facility, no trace of the two men who took him from the hospital. It was as if he simply vanished. Some researchers have suggested that John Doe might have been an individual with an extreme congenital condition who was being hidden by family ashamed of his differences, and that when he was discovered, the family reclaimed him and continued hiding him until his death. Others have proposed more exotic theories, that he represented some kind of genetic mutation that produced a form of human adapted to high-gravity environments, though where such an adaptation would have come from on Earth is unexplained, or even that he was something other than human, though his DNA, which was analyzed from preserved blood samples and showed normal human chromosomes, argues against this. The case of John Doe remains unsolved. Somewhere, if the timeline is accurate, there might be an individual in their late 80s who is extraordinarily dense and heavy, living in obscurity. Or more likely, the boy died decades ago and was buried without any public record. These two cases, the Sullivan twins and John Doe, represent extremes of human biological variation that challenge our categories and our understanding. Grace and Helen showed us that the boundaries between individual consciousness might be more permeable than we assume, that two people can be connected in ways that are physiological, not just emotional, in ways that are essential to survival. John Doe showed us that human biology might have parameters far wider than we recognize, that the body might be capable of configurations of density, metabolism, and cellular structure that we've never documented in any medical literature. Both cases remind us that for all our scientific progress, for all our genetic sequencing and brain imaging and metabolic analysis, there are still human beings who don't fit into our models, who exist at the margins of what we think is possible. They force us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we mean by normal, about whether our understanding of human biology is actually comprehensive or just based on the limited sample we've studied. These cases continue to haunt us today. If you were as disturbed as we were, leave a like, comment your theories, and share with anyone brave enough to listen. Explore our channel to discover more unsolved mysteries, bizarre cases, and the darkest secrets in history. If you haven't subscribed yet, join the brave ones who follow our cases. Hit that subscribe button. Turn on notification bells so you won't miss any new case. Leave your like if this video got you thinking. And share it with that friend who says they're not afraid of anything. The comments are open. Tell us what other impossible cases you want us to investigate. Until next time, and sleep well if you can.